whose name has popped up for me.
Uh-huh.
Wonderful.
Okay, we just started the recording, and I will go ahead and let Celise take it away. We'll try to stay timely here. Go ahead, Celise.
Okay, hi there and good afternoon to all of you. Thank you for joining the AXA Brandman University webinar on experience, context, and perspective. It's my honor to introduce Dr. Barbara Bartel, who with Brandman University acts as longtime partner in our Partner for Purpose program. She'll share with you more about today's presentation.
Okay, great. Thank you, Celise. And yes, first I have to say thank you to AXA. We have been Partners for Purpose, what they call P for P, for many, many years running, as long as I've been here, which is 11 years now. And our partnership really has grown over the last 6 years. Very happy to be working with AXA. As a Partner for Purpose, we will be recording this presentation today, and it will be later placed on the AXA Resource Hub. So if you are unable to join us today and I'm sending you an email and you get it, you can go ahead and click on there and take a look at this presentation, as well as all of our previous presentations on the fabulous AXA Resource Hub. And today's workshop will, of course, be a framework of experience, content, and perspective, as you see. And we have 5 different presenters today. So I won't go into too deep of a bio, but I wanted to introduce Dr. Nikisha Castillo, who oversees Brandman psychology programs and is also a professor in the School of Arts and Sciences here at Brandman University. Then there's Dr. Dustin Domingo, who is the Director of Credential Services at Brandman University. Dr. Jalynn Brooks, who is faculty for the School of Education doctoral program, as well as an associate professor in the School of Business and Professional Studies. Dr. Don Scott, who is the Director of Advising and Retention Services here at Brandman University, and Dr. Leticia Rojas, who is a professor at Pasadena City College. They've been working on this presentation together. They do workshops and conferences and things like that, so I'm sure that you're going to really enjoy this presentation, and their information will be available there, as you see on the screen. So take it away, team.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Bartels, and thank you to AXA for not only the invitation, but also for being a partner and just creating this Wednesday webinar series. We're really glad to be a part of it. As mentioned before, I am Jalynn Johnson. You see my name on the screen first, and I want to go ahead and tell you who you're looking at in this photo, because 4 of our 5 team members are pictured. I am far left, and then next to me, to my left, your right, is Dr. Nikisha Castillo, and then Dr. Dustin Domingo, Dr. Donald B. Scott, and then we'll have a wonderful picture of Dr. Rojas a little bit later for you all to view. So thank you for having us. Today, we're really pleased to have the opportunity to share with you what, from our perspective, is really a snapshot of some of the work that we do that surrounds this concept of valuing connection with our students. And so we focus on how hearing their stories, acknowledging the value of their individual narratives, really based on their lived experiences, is so important to the work that we do. And we know that this expands across venues within the education system, both K-12, higher ed. We're seeing it now in our communities with distance learning and this understanding of what this new world looks like with online learning as well. And so we're looking through the lenses that each of us bring to the table from our different roles, our different backgrounds, and how we can apply that to the work that we do. So today, when we focus on this ECP framework, experience, context, and perspective, it's done with this understanding in mind that we know that culture and diversity shape students and institutional stakeholders' experiences in any of their educational settings, but also beyond what's in the classroom. We'll also talk some about the Cultural Competence Continuum. And as an example, befitting our discussion, we'll look at imposter syndrome and then also address student experience and what that means within the creation, development, and really just maintaining an inclusive classroom environment, whether it be in person or in this virtual setting, again, like we're all experiencing today. And then all the while looking at attainable action steps that we can apply to move forward towards our goal. So when we look ahead, and consider what it is that we're supposed to be focusing on, not only as educators, but just as advocates for students. The goal is always to be able to address issues of equity and inclusion in education through value and lived experiences. And so one of the things that we did was to begin with the ECP framework, as mentioned before. So a little bit about what this is. When we are talking about our lived experiences, even though we're coming from that viewpoint of being instructors or student advocates in the different roles that we have, we also understand that the way that we connect with our students best is not only considering our lived experiences and how it affects the way that we view our interactions and our relationship with our students, but also having this ongoing goal to be able to hear and value their respective narratives. So when we went through and looked at some of the efforts that we do through our education and academic efforts or through research and presentations, we also took a step back to see how it was that these things that we had gone through, whether it be in the classroom or in our lives, were influencing our efforts. So each time that we focus on how our lived experiences influence that interaction with our students and those that we advocate for, we had to remember that being cognizant of that also meant acknowledging that some of the students or even our colleagues are going to have different experiences than we do. And when we're working with students, as each of you know, we don't necessarily know what they've gone through. And through the work that we do, we come to understand that our role is also to be mindful of the fact that many of the populations that we serve from our student body are underserved. This might include students who navigate a wide range of systemic barriers. We're learning now that we've got students who don't necessarily have the equipment or the tools to be distance learners. What sorts of accommodations are we making to be able to consider their lived experience through this pandemic, for example, and how we can better reach them and continue to focus on their needs? We've got students who are minoritized. We have students who face accessibility concerns, and those who are the face, if you will, of this discussion that we engage on equity. And so by us examining ourselves first, we're also doing a better job at engaging with our students and understanding those very needs that we're going to be talking about today. So if we can just take the time to consider our respective levels of awareness initially as it relates to the needs and the lived experiences of our students, we'll begin with what we consider equitable self-observation. And doing so will allow us to be able to find a better way to move forward and value our students' narratives. So what we're going to do now is transition and take a look at how our understanding of where we are on the cultural competence continuum will help us to determine where we might begin this personal work.
Hi, folks. Can you hear me? This is Dustin Domingo.
Sounds good, Dustin.
Okay, great. So a little background on the cultural competence continuum. It is rooted in kind of the practices of healthcare professionals. It was created in 1989 by researchers, one of whom is Cross, and it's meant to be a way to gauge our personal behaviors, to measure how culturally competent we are. Cultural competence is our ability to engage in successful interactions with folks who are different from us. So in this conversation that we're having about engaging with diverse students and recognizing everyone's lived experiences, we should be using the cultural competence continuum to assess our own individual behaviors and perspectives to make sure that we are interacting with our students in ways that do demonstrate that we value their lived experiences, and demonstrate that we are making efforts to become more inclusive in our practices in education spheres. So the levels of cultural competence on your screen go from 1 to 6. So those at level 1 are less culturally competent. Those at level 6 are more culturally competent. And for clarity, I'd like to say that these levels are not what you should attribute to your identity. Think of them more in terms of this conversation as ways to assess your behaviors. So is XYZ action representative of someone who is culturally competent or culturally proficient, or is it representative of somebody who is culturally destructive? So if I can go to the next screen here to show you examples of behaviors that demonstrate these levels of cultural competence, we'll see a little bit more of what that looks like in an education setting. So behaviors that are culturally destructive um, really relate to overtly dehumanizing a minority student. So those are acts of overt racism. Uh, Behaviors that demonstrate cultural incapacity refer to beliefs that there is a supreme or dominant culture. You might not necessarily act on those beliefs, but those are beliefs that you might hold. Cultural blindness refers to ignoring cultural strengths, encouraging assimilation, and victim blaming. So the important part about cultural blindness is I would say the majority of folks fall within that, and it's not necessarily coming from a negative space. Folks who are culturally blind often, or folks who demonstrate behaviors that are culturally blind, are trying to be good human beings. They're coming from a philanthropic perspective, they're trying to generate togetherness, but by doing that, they're encouraging assimilation, which inadvertently devalues that other person's lived experience. So we got to be really careful about that. The next stage here is cultural pre-competence. So an individual who's demonstrating cultural pre-competence realizes their own weaknesses in serving minorities, but they just don't know yet what to do to adapt or accommodate these diverse needs that people have. Cultural competence refers to engaging in continuous self-assessment, right? We're continually checking in with ourselves to see what our behaviors are demonstrating, how are we interacting with other folks, and we're taking it a step further and seeking best practices to serve our diverse students or to engage with diverse cultures. Cultural proficiency takes that a step further. Um, an individual who is culturally proficient is culturally competent, but they're also sharing their best practices with others. They're creating best practices, putting them into writing, and engaging with stakeholders to make sure that these are institutionalized.
Thanks, Dustin. So as we begin to look at another element that would influence how anybody would come to their lived experience, a lot of the stuff that we're talking about really kind of tends to be some of the things that externally people are dealing with. And Dustin did a great job of talking about some of the things that people may be dealing with from an external standpoint. What the imposter syndrome is all about is it's an opportunity for us to start to think about what are the internal barriers that our students or we as individuals may be facing. So as the director of advising at Brandman University, I'm constantly interested in learning at what is impacting student success and achievement. And that's really what I bring to this group. So my reason for being here is to introduce you to the concept, if you've never been introduced to something called the imposter syndrome, which was first named in 1978 by a couple of psychologists that were looking at the lived experiences of 150 high-achieving women. And based upon the clinical work that they were doing with these individuals, they began to put together some themes that each of these individuals were expressing. And I'm going to read this definition to you because the key pieces that you want to focus on are the words that are highlighted. So the imposter syndrome is a construct that describes highly successful individuals who experience feelings of fraudulence, a fear of being exposed, and the inability to internalize actual success. The reason that this becomes such an important element for you to consider in the context of today's discussion is because, again, if you think about all of these things, these are all internal barriers that somebody is generally facing that they may be very unwilling to share with the outside world. It also poses the question for us to all think about is, why should this matter? If you have a student or if you yourself are dealing with some of these internal feelings, why should it matter that you're considering how this is impacting your ability to move forward? Some people may look at this as, this only affects people who, struggle with certain things internally. But the thing that I want to draw out, if you've never, heard much about the imposter syndrome, is that you'll find that very famous people such as, Tom Hanks and Tina Fey, Maya Angelou, Howard Schultz of Starbucks, they have all over the course of time expressed their own internal feelings of what the imposter syndrome is all about. So I want to make sure that all of us are thinking in terms of the fact that this is not limited to just people who don't find success in the world. It can affect anybody. And as you're thinking about students who are sitting in your classroom or thinking about people who work next door to you, it's something to really think about. So I mentioned the imposter syndrome was developed in 1978, and it is based upon a scale that one of the psychologists, Pauline Clance, created. If you're ever interested in taking this assessment on your own, you can go out on the internet and look for the Clance Imposter Phenomenon Scale. You'll hear it referred to as the SIP scale. It's a 20-item survey that will allow you to place yourself on a scale based upon how often you deal with the various things that affect somebody if they are identified as dealing with the imposter. One of the most important elements that you may want to consider if you do identify somebody, either yourself or somebody else that you know who is dealing with the imposter syndrome, is to look at the visual on the left-hand side of the screen. This is a great representation of something called the imposter cycle, which is what any imposter will generally encounter. And the thing to know about this is that this is something that this process that you're seeing depicted here can take place over a matter of minutes, or it can take place over a matter of months. And when you think about somebody who is dealing with the various characteristics that are often associated with, and I encourage you to read about with somebody who's dealing with the imposter cycle, most people who are dealing with it are dealing with a couple of different characteristics. And if they're caught in this cycle, you can see how it becomes kind of this self-perpetuating barrier that they may have a difficult time overcoming. The last thing that I'll share with you before we turn it over to Dr. Rojas and Dr. Castillo is that, there are certainly coping mechanisms that somebody can develop if they identify themselves as somebody who's dealing with the imposter syndrome. And I call them the slice tips. If you're ever interested in learning more about what these could actually represent to you, I would encourage you to reach out to any of us, and we can talk you through how somebody could potentially think through how these tips could help them. But if you look at each one of them individually as you see them on the screen, you're going to begin to realize that this is something that it really does generally take somebody identifying it within their own being, that it's something that they have to deal with, they have to be able to be willing to acknowledge. And in many cases, if they're willing to divulge this to somebody who they consider to be a mentor, a teacher, a great coworker, a boss, this is something that they can, they may be dealing with internally, but it's something that is less of a bit of a stigma that they have to overcome on their own. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Castillo and Dr. Rojas to take us through a great exercise to help you begin to explore this on your own behalf.
Thank you, Dr. Scott. Can you guys hear me? It's typed in the chat pane.
Yes.
If you have access to that. Thank you. Perfect. So thank you, Dr. Scott, for bringing us through the imposter syndrome. As I'm thinking and I'm looking in our chat, and I see that many of us are educators or individuals who are part of the higher educational system. And as we're looking at that, what we want to do is to ensure that we create spaces for our students in which they can develop and grow both intellectually and emotionally, so that they can thrive and continue to share their lived experiences throughout their educational journey. And so in creating spaces where they grow intellectually, students will be able to develop the skills, information, and further enhance their analytical abilities. And emotionally, we can teach them to value consciousness, self and social awareness, which is a big part of that engaging the student, understanding their narrative, and cherishing the narratives and the backgrounds from which they come from. So what we want is when the students sit in the classroom, they too feel as if they belong in that space that they're in. And as Dr. Scott said, that they're not imposters. Oftentimes I've heard students say, well, I don't belong here because I come from a background in which I'm first generation graduate from high school and trajecting all the way on up to a master's degree. And so they don't understand where they fit in and how they fit in. But as educators and individuals who teach in higher education, we want to be able to create that space for them and to help them to feel as part of the institution themselves. And so when we create these spaces for them, we help our students to develop the competency intellectually and emotionally so that they can become leaders in their professions. And so by ensuring these inclusive spaces, what we do is we have to continue to nurture our student story, help them to develop the chapters in their educational journey, understand how their lived experiences and their cultural background influence the ways in which they function, both inside and outside of the classroom, because they bring their lived experiences from outside of the classroom inside, and that's what helps them to thrive as students. What I do love is the analogy, and Jillian, you can go to the next slide as I continue to talk. I love the analogy, and a few colleagues of mine as well this week brought it up, but I've been using it with this whole experiences that we're all living through, is being in the boat. So all of our students come in the classroom and they're all in this boat together. But each of the stories that they tell about being in that boat is going to be different. And we want to ensure that their journey on that boat is one that's in which they feel included. Although, you know, sometimes when you go on a boat or you ever go rafting, it's always a little bumpy or sometimes you fall out, but there's someone there to help you back in the boat. And that is our job as individuals who work in higher education, is to bring them back into that boat. And so collectively, we're helping them to grow as individual and ensuring that their experiences is one that they can go beyond our different institution. So for this next part of the presentation, it's very much going to be interactive. And so as we create this space of interaction, I hope that you're able to either unmute or use the chat pane to engage in a discussion with us.
Thank you, Dr. Castillo. Along with that, as we start to think about our own particular roles at our institutions, right? I know that there might be folks in this space who are school administrators, others who work directly with students as counselors, and others as faculty. But collectively, how do we work together to create inclusive spaces? And we've been engaged in this work, all of us on this panel, from different facets of one, our labor with and work with students, but also in terms of our research and in terms of our areas of interest. But something that we keep coming back to is these 3 steps in helping promote inclusive spaces. The first one being understanding our own dispositions, privilege, and power, right? So all of us come into spaces with particular dispositions, worldviews, right, that are made up by both our lived experiences and our learning in and outside of institutions, as well as positions of privilege. And so those positions of privilege will be different based on who we are and based on how we enter spaces. The second step that we'll also touch on along throughout the presentation is the importance of understanding our students' strengths and needs, right? Understanding who they are collectively, right? As we think about their demographics, as we think about our general kind of understanding of who they are, but also understanding that there's incredible diversity within groups of students, and that we need to also understand students on a humanistic individual level as well. And then the third step is applying this understanding to our practice, right? So understanding that we come with particular privileges and how power dynamics might impact relationships with students, understanding students, and then applying all of that understanding to actual practice so that we can have tangible action items. If we can go to the next slide. And so we wanted to pause here as we think about, really understanding who our students are. And we know that some of you might be from different institutions. We want you to think about the demographics or the character of your students, right? So I, for example, am teaching at a community college, and Dr. Castillo is teaching at Brandman University. So we might have very different students. We might have some overlap there, but we want you to think about the demographics, the characteristics of your students, and then go ahead and type into the chat at least 4 characteristics that come to mind when you think about your students. And it can be as open-ended as you'd like. And then if any of you want to share through the mic, we're also definitely open to hearing different voices. So I hear some folks are saying parents, caregivers, multitaskers, problem solvers. So again, go ahead and type into the chat, what are some characteristics that come to mind? And I'm not sure, Dr. Castillo, if you can see the chat. I see diverse, they're coming in, diverse, first generation college students.
Yeah, I'm happy to read some. This is Dr. Barbara Bartles. Multitaskers, problem solvers, military students, young new high school graduates, different age groups, diversity, first generation, various socioeconomic backgrounds.
Great. As we think about all of these defining characteristics, and again, understanding that they're kind of umbrella terms and there's great diversity and intersectionality within each of those descriptors, we start to think about not only who our students are, but some of the strengths that they come with, right? So we also want to have an assets-based approach where if we are working with diverse student populations, all of the knowledge systems and all of the assets and strengths that they come with, as well as what are the structural challenges that students, perhaps, for example, students of color might face or students who are veterans might face. And so this deepening of understanding and learning and reflecting on who our students are. You can go to the next slide.
Thank you, Dr. Rojas. So at this point in our presentation, we'll continue to ask you to engage with us as we talk about understanding our own disposition and position of privilege and power that we have as individuals who are what I would consider like one above our students. Some of our students are, as we know, at the university I work for, are adult learners, and having that understanding that they're coming in with experience already of being in the workforce. And so being an individual who has the opportunity to engage with them, I have to understand my own privilege and power and where I come from. And so we're going to take this time to read a few statements to you on the use of privilege and power, and see if someone can keep up with the chat pane as I read the statements to see how you fall into the different positions. And then afterwards, we'll take time to process some of the information that we'll share with you there. So if you can relate to the statement that I make, you can type yes in the chat pane or no to the statement that's made. So the first statement is, I am a college graduate. Also, I'm seeing yes coming in.
Lots of yeses going on there.
Yes. All right. I'm going to move on. Our next statement is, I am able-bodied. And, you know, your definition of able-bodied is dependent on you.
All yeses there.
Okay. And then I see people who look like me on television, and looking like me depends on how you want to define yourself and how that relates to you. So when you turn on the TV, I see people who look like me.
Mm-hmm.
We have one no so far, sometimes, and a yes.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Our next statement is, when in a store, I sometimes get followed or am mistaken for a worker.
Mm.
And I can relate to that. When that does happen, I tell individuals, let me help you with that. And then I point them to the individual that can better help them.
That's very gracious of you.
I try.
Got a couple yeses on that and a couple no's on that.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly translated into a more positive potential outcome and experience.
Right. Because sometimes we tend to go to the emotional state reaction of, well, why would you think that I work here? Although that is where I want to go sometime, but my mind says no. Help them out because they obviously need direction, and they, I tend to wear, what is it, khaki and burgundy every time I walk into Target. And so I think that I just stand out as one of the workers. But besides, all jokes aside, sometimes it's we just feel, why would you think that I work here? And then I reevaluate that and then turn it into something optimistic, as you said, Dr. Johnson.
Yeah, if I can speak to that a little bit too, one of the experiences that I've had as a high school teacher, which I did for several years, is having my students repeatedly, especially my the young men of color that I worked with, kind of repeatedly say, when we go into the store, people follow us, right? Or people look at us and assume particular things. And so I think coming from a position where I'm not a young man of color, I think for me to understand that that we all have different experiences based on our perception and then based on what other people perceive and potential biases that might exist.
Definitely. Thank you, Dr. Rojas. Our next statement is, I didn't have to take out student loans to go to college. I see we have no's in there, and then someone says they are in debt. So I understand that in debt part is a lot of us on here may. Some said they didn't go to college here in the US, so no, they didn't have, that doesn't relate to them. Okay, we're gonna move on. Type in, if I am able to talk to I am able to talk about my intimate relationship in any social context without being judged. Okay, I see a lot of no's coming in. And we're going to take time to talk about each of these and your experience as you're hearing the questions or answering the questions in a few minutes. Our next one is, I have never been judged by the way or the language that I speak. So I've never been judged by the way I speak or the language that I speak. Dr. Rojas, you want to take the others?
Sure. I think we have a couple more. The next one is, my expertise has never been questioned. My expertise has never been questioned. So I think this one and then the question prior, there's mixed kind of reactions. There's yes, I've been questioned, no. And so as we begin to think about our different places, whether they be work, whether they be in professional or personal settings, what are some of our experiences that come to that? So if we want to maybe switch to the next slide. So I think one of the things that that we wanted to do was have a hold, even if a short discussion amongst folks in this space, so that's really experiential. One of the things that we do with this particular exercise of what we've done when it's not a virtual setting is we've had people get up from where they're sitting and with particular statements either move forward or move outside of the circle, just to allow people to visually kind of see where people's different experiences. But here we would like is for us to have a collective conversation about, while doing this exercise, what thoughts come to mind. That's one of the questions. The second one is, in what ways are you similar or different to your students? How might privilege or lack thereof manifest itself in the classroom? And then what are you currently feeling? Because we want to make sure that we validate people's feelings and responses But the first one being is, while doing this exercise, what thoughts came to mind? So if folks want to share through the mic, we'd love to hear your voice. If you want to type in the chat box, we also welcome that. So while doing this exercise, what thoughts come to mind?
Dr. Rojas, while folks consider, this is Dr. Johnson, one of the things just for myself in the moment as an observer that I noticed was some of the thoughtfulness that clearly took place before people typed for some of those questions. And I think it really speaks to this overall message that we're continuing to come back to in regards to considering our lived experiences. There are a lot of times where things have happened with us, to us. We've experienced things that we simply haven't thought about in this context. And so being able to be, as you mentioned before, in this space and doing so purposefully even comes across in the chat pane, which I think is a really important thing to consider.
Thank you so much for that. I think other folks are typing, remembering what it's like to feel new to experience, that I'm not alone. We need to do these exercises more often. It really puts things into perspective. And I think someone else was trying to use the microphone.
It's Bartles. I was just going to read it for you, but you're good. I forgot you guys can see the chat box. Thank you.
Thank you.
I just want to comment on that one comment that said, the thought that came to mind is that, it really puts things into perspective, and putting things into perspective helps us as individuals begin the process of self-healing, self-reflection. And by doing self-healing and reflection, it helps us to be able to better understand where our students are coming from, because we've dealt with our own experiences that we've had. When we talked about, we asked the question, have you ever been questioned? Or have you ever not walked into a store? The question, have you ever been questioned? Sorry. Or, seeing individuals that look like me? There are a lot of yeses and nos there. And if you're questioned in your position, it's hard as individuals to move forward. And in doing so, we have to reflect on, well, why am I being questioned? What can I do? Also, not blaming yourself on what can I do, but helping find individuals that can support me so that I can better process when I'm questioned. What does that mean for me, or why do I react the way that I do?
Mm-hmm. And then just to add to that as well, I think these types of exercises allow for a couple of things to happen. One is reflection on your particular experience, right? So we navigate the world from our particular perspective or disposition. So these types of questions allow us to reflect, okay, what is my experience? And then also allow us to start to think about, well, what are other people's experiences, right? That might be the same or differ from me, and what might be some of the structures or larger kind of, factors at play there. So for example, the second question is, in what ways are you similar or different to your students? I think about now teaching at the community college level and now having to go virtual and through Zoom. It's very glaringly, I think, obvious to me that some students have access to technology and can access my assignments, and are, for the most part, transitioning fairly decently to now the virtual online courses. And I also have a lot of students who are struggling tremendously, who might not have stable internet, who have many people living in the same household, who are now essential employees, right? And because who kind of works at grocery stores is a lot of young people. And so students who are now working 50 plus hours with the income for their family. And so recently, it's been even much more obvious to me about the privilege that I walk into spaces now that I can still keep my job during this time, or I have stable, kind of relatively stable internet, right? It depends on the day of the week, but for the most part, it's again, as we start to decenter ourselves, understanding the privilege that we come with, but also then having the ability to think about people's situations that might be different from us, especially our students.
There were a few others in the chat that we didn't get to when we asked about the thoughts that came to mind. Can we just go over those, or are you ready for it? Okay, so some individuals stated, the thought that came to mind is that it was hard for me to understand some of the question Was the answers yes or no? Was I hearing the question correct? And then others said understanding where someone is coming from helps me not to feel judged. Understanding perspective is the key there. And then another individual stated, I've done this exercise many times before, and it's always difficult for me to answer some of the questions with a clear yes or no. And we see that sometimes when we do this in person, where individuals are on the bridge of like, yes, I want to stand over here, or I want to stand over there, I fall in the middle. So you're right where you need to be, this individual. Because they said, because people have trouble identifying me racially and context matters. The thing skipped on me, sorry. My husband is white, so if I'm out in public with him, people around respond to me very differently than if I'm out in public alone. Also, in terms of the intimate relationship, many people still assume that someone's spouse is of the same race. When my husband and I challenge that assumption, we get a lot of questions there. Questions that demonstrate more assumptions that I don't always have, that I don't always feel like answering. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that's incredibly important point, that context does matter, and some of our identity markers or even the questions that we posed are not set in stone, right? So, for example, I don't think we had a question about ageism, but or at least, but we all get older with time, and so some of us might experience ageism later in life, or some of us might experience particular forms of privilege in one space and then move to another space and not necessarily have that privilege, right? And so I talked a little bit earlier about my particular maybe privilege with my students in terms of having a particular income or whatnot. And might that privilege then be different in another space where I am the only woman of color in a space with other professionals? And so I think it's incredibly important to think about context, and then coming back to our classrooms and our work with young folks, or our work with students, I should say, how does their particular privilege play out in classrooms? And then how also might we also acknowledge that there are sometimes in our classrooms with particular challenges compared to some of their classmates. So even thinking about class discussions that we have with students, sometimes if you are faculty, or class or discussions that you might have with faculty if you are an administrator, do particular privileges play out in who is more active in discussions, or do our examples that we provide as faculty or we provide as administrators, are they only speaking to one particular group as opposed to being inclusive of different experiences? Right. So as we think about, how might privilege and lack thereof manifest itself in the classroom, that's important also to think about your own experience and then your students as well.
We can go on to the next slide, please, Dr. Johnson. So as we move forward, we're keeping track of time. We just want you to consider, what is your role in removing barriers and promoting student success? Whether it's in the classroom, you're seeing them in the hallway, on campus, interacting with them over the web, especially that's what a lot of us are doing right now, helping our students to be successful and to accomplish the goals in which they set out for educationally. Next slide, please, Dr. Johnson. So another part in which you get to interact is, what are 3 to 5 best practices you utilize to promote inclusivity and equity at your institution? So as you think about yourself, what is it that you do to help promote inclusivity and equity at your institution? Someone said asking students what they need on their terms and not assuming what they need, especially right now, our current global crisis. Exactly. So taking time to ask them, if they send an email, I've been struggling with this assignment, I need to turn it in late. I tend to ask them, okay, when do you need when can you have the assignment turned in? Instead of saying a steadfast, you need to turn it on Tuesday by midnight, I ask them so I can accommodate their schedule, because if they're sick, there's a reason, or if they have a sick child, they need that accommodation some way or another. So practicing empathy is my favorite thing, as well as flexibility, but also finding that gray line between empathy and flexibility and sternness as well.
Mm-hmm.
Anyone else? Best practice. This is where we get to share with those amongst us what they can do to promote inclusivity. Humility, yeah, exactly. Practicing humility is good. Yes, looking at the basic needs are essential. There, as a clinician as well, wearing that hat, I always say I can't do therapy with a client if they come in and they're hungry, if they're homeless, and if they don't feel like they're part of a community. I can't ask you to talk about what's going on for you emotionally. So making sure their basic needs are met as well. Someone said, I positively communicate, provide clarity without assumptions, meet with them one-on-one, showing human kindness. And that's the best thing we can do, is to humanize our students and to help them to understand what's going on for them, and having compassion. Yes, Dr. Johnson, is the biggest thing that's there. And thinking about our lived experiences, right? Because that's what empathy is as well. Thinking about when we were students, or when we were once part of the classroom, what that was like for us as well. If no one else, Dr. Johnson, we're going to move on to the next slide, looking at time and wanting to allow individuals to participate and ask questions. So as it relates to removing barriers and promoting student success, what are some of your best practices to support all students? So what do you do to support all students across the board? So we already said kindness, compassion, understanding differences. Having that one-on-one with the student. So even if I had a meeting at noon and the student came in at noon and they really needed to talk, then extending that time to them or rescheduling with them to have that conversation and discussion with them. Dr. Johnson, nothing is happening in the chat pane, so we're just going to move forward so we can continue to wrap this up.
Yeah. I did want to add one more thing, or at least as I'm listening to people's responses, it sounds like a lot of folks are practicing inclusivity and equity in terms of your relationships with the folks around you, right? Whether, again, they be different stakeholders, your students. And so I think that really highlights the importance of relationship building in the line of work that we're all in. That education and teaching and schooling is all about the relationships that we have with people and how we demonstrate caring, right? And also thinking about equity and inclusion in terms of the curriculum. If we are in the classroom setting, like what types of curriculum are we creating and implementing in our classrooms, and then what kinds of pedagogical practices are we also, kind of having in our classrooms? Because one thing is to say, I'm someone who wants an equity-oriented classroom, and then really examining, like, do the practices, do the activities that I have in my classroom, do the assignments that I have in my classroom, are they representative of the kind of philosophy that I believe I have? So I think just really, again, awesome to hear kind of how we're centering personalization of teaching here.
And I think you make an excellent point, Dr. Rojas, because I think that, one of the things that we cannot allow ourselves to do is to grow complacent, right? I mean, we need to constantly be checking in with ourselves, finding colleagues and peers who might help us be accountable in those areas, right? Looking at what I'm doing to create and maintain these equitable spaces, but also, am I doing enough? And realize that it's okay to ask that question. Surround yourself with peers or colleagues or professional or academic friend groups that will absolutely help you do that. And I think all of us have been in that space before. We might just need someone to let us know when we can step outside of our box or our boundary a little bit. So before we kind of transition into our close, we really wanted to just take a moment and recap some of the things that we've covered, but also to look at them as attainable action steps. We gave you this overview, if you will, kind of a window, as I mentioned before, into the work that we do and the research that we do. But all of this is attainable. And so a few of these things, really just considering your own thoughts is where they begin. So considering how our lived experiences shape the context with which we view any given situation. Again, a personal reflective item. Recognizing the influence that this has on the perspectives that we bring to the classroom. And as many of you know, that's not just what you're saying when you're on your mic right now virtually, or when we get back into that classroom on ground space, but also the curriculum that you're developing. And that's a whole other discussion for us, but it's another area that we definitely consider. Becoming cognizant of where we lie on the cultural competence continuum. As Dr. Domingo said, we have to look at that and understand that each of these levels really are, and I know Dr. Domingo does a lot of research in this area, but they are fluid. And I think it's important to remember that whereas you may begin in one area on the continuum, you can progress, you can move forward, but it's all about the work and the level of awareness followed by determination that you put into it. And so these are things that we aspire to. Additionally, a focus on how we can learn more about and connect with our students, right? Examining the realities that are impacting the way that they learn and navigate the student experience. Much like in the SPLICE model that you saw from Dr. Scott, we don't always know where, as far as the experience, yes, but also the mental state, the emotional state, where our students are at any given time. And so allowing ourselves to be able to be open, and as many people in the chat said today, asking those questions, showing that type of empathy, allowing yourself to understand that the things that they are experiencing may be different than what you yourself have experienced is a first step. And that goes hand in hand with identifying and also understanding our own dispositions. And then lastly, with the ones you see on the screen, these are those areas where the work comes in. So we've done some of the self-reflection at this point. We're allowing ourselves to sometimes be vulnerable, to let our guard down on the barriers that we have as instructor, as educator, as advisor, as director, as superintendent, to be able to look at our own positions of privilege and power and see how that might influence the relationship we have with our student body, with our individual students, and also with those people who we support that are educating the students that we serve. Additionally, determining and implementing steps to remove barriers to student success, and creating the inclusive classroom space, much like Dr. Castillo and Dr. Rojas walked us through. These are things that do take forethought and do take management, but they are possible, they are actionable and attainable. And then instituting the best practices that come from that to support our student learners so that we can maintain all of those efforts to not only hear, but value our student stories. When we talk about that narrative, it takes us back to an African proverb that struck me as a child that has never left and that I continue to remind myself of daily. Speaking of that narrative, and that is, until the lions have their own historians, the history of the hunt will always glorify the hunter. Until we allow our students to be able to give us their lived experiences and share their narrative and explain to us where they're coming from, we're never going to be able to work with them in a way that is going to promote student success. And we're also not going to be able to show them how their individual lived experiences can be nurtured and can also help shape them into the successful graduates that we want them to be. So we ask you to consider this and to think about all the things that we've shared with you today. And of course, to follow up with us, we're all available. You can see our email addresses or links on the screen. And we really just want to say thank you, not only for the time, but also for the engagement. And we certainly hope that you have taken away more than just the tidbits that we've shared, but also the desire and the willingness to think through these things for yourself, and then also get to that point where you're comfortable, or at least considering sharing some of these ideas with others. Thank you. And Dr. Bartels, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you so much to each and every one of you. I really appreciate the time you gave us today. As I mentioned for our attendees, this will be posted on the AXA Resource Hub. You will see numerous opportunities, webinars, some of our white papers that Brandman University and AXA have been partnering together on sharing. So if you have any questions about Brandman University and all of the programs that we do offer, feel free to contact me. I will type my name in the chat box. And again, visit AXA's Hub to see the different opportunities that we have available. Thank you, everyone, and thank you for attending today. We will have more upcoming in the future. Thank you, Celeste.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Absolutely, yes, you can share it with fellow teachers that could not attend. Anything on the Resource Hub is open, available for free access for anyone. So you can just go ahead and go to axa.org and you can find the Resource Hub there. I'm typing this in the chat box. Resource Hub. And that has numerous resources, not only from Brandman University, various white papers we've done, other webinars we've conducted with AXA, but it has a plethora of information, especially during these trying times. AXA is doing some great other opportunities. I know that the Executive Director, Wes, just spoke the other day on a Facebook Live event. So definitely visit axa.org. Great place to see a variety of different things. Any other questions for us out there? All right, then. Well, thank you so much. Have a great day.